Intel's 10th gen Core CPUs launched today, along with a slew of new LGA 1200 motherboards with 400 series chipsets. So I will be sharing benchmarks so you can get a better idea of the performance. There's a whole stack of 10th gen CPUs in this launch, starting with i3s that have hyper-threading now, all the way up to the new Core i9-10900K flagship that now has 10 cores and 20 threads. Today I will be focusing on the flagship 10900K, but I'm also working on some benchmarks for the new 6-core 12-thread 10600K. That video should be up tomorrow, so if you want to see it when it's ready, I would suggest subscribing to my YouTube channel. That said, let's get started.
Excellent!
The Dark Core RGB Pro is a premium wireless gaming mouse from Corsair with a long list of features like an 18,000 dpi low-power PixArt optical sensor for maximum precision with minimal power usage, attractive 9-zone dynamic RGB backlighting, and a comfortable contoured shape with 2 interchangeable side grips included. Connect wirelessly via Corsair's sub-1 millisecond slipstream technology, via Bluetooth for convenience on the go, or wired via USB-C. Durable arm-round switches, up to 50 hours of battery life, 8 fully programmable buttons, and more, so click the sponsor link in the description for details. So here's my table of contents, and I will also add timestamps in the description and comment section down below if you want to jump ahead. But I'm going to cover the basic specs of these CPUs I'm testing first, then some words on my test setup and methodology, then I will talk you guys through the benchmarks themselves, then some overclocking, then some overall performance comparisons and conclusions. The 10900K though is the follow-up to the 9900K from 9th gen, and it now has 10 cores and 20 threads, up from 8 and 16 with the 9900K. It's still going to be $500, and I like that Intel is adding more cores and threads to mainstream CPUs, but the competition is pretty fierce over on AMD's side, where I will be comparing the 10900K to the Ryzen 3900X, which has 12 cores and 24 threads, which was originally $500, but can now be found for a discounted price of around $420 to $450, quite easily I might add. There's also the flagship 3950X, with 16 cores and 32 threads, and also the best single core performance on the Ryzen side, which was originally $750 but now goes for about $720. To sum up the 10th gen though, Intel is now shipping more cores, more threads, and higher frequencies on all of its CPUs pretty much across the board, with the 10900K now hitting up to 5.3 gigahertz on 1 or 2 cores out of the box, thanks to Intel's Turbo Boost Max 3.0 technology, as well as thermal velocity boost technology, which basically bump the CPU speeds up to higher frequencies if thermals are within a set range and if power limits aren't reached. Unfortunately, power limits get reached fairly quickly at stock, but more on that in just a minute. Intel is hoping that the high frequencies of these new CPUs will make up for where it's lacking versus AMD, because Intel is still manufacturing CPUs using 14 nanometer technology, whereas with Ryzen 3000 series, AMD is now on 7 nanometer, which greatly benefits efficiency. One other comparative point I wanted to make was about the platform and motherboard support. For Intel 10th gen, you'll need one of these new 400 series motherboards with the LGA 1200 chipset. I was sent several of these Z490 motherboards for launch, like this Gigabyte Z490 Aorus Master or the Asus ROG Maximus 12 Hero Wi-Fi right here, but I can only really test with one motherboard. So I went with the MSI Meg Z490 Ace, and I mainly did that because it was one of the first ones to arrive, along with the MSI Godlike, but the Godlike is ridiculously overpriced. So I thought this would be slightly more reasonable. More to the point though, this is kind of a negative. You need a new motherboard in order to use one of these 10th gen CPUs, but on the plus side, there does seem to be plenty of Z490 options out there that allow overclocking with K-SKU Intel CPUs that actually start out somewhat reasonably priced, at least if you're comparing it to older unlocked for overclocking motherboards from Intel. About $150 to $160 is what I've seen the cheapest ones at. Of course, motherboard reviews notwithstanding, we'll have to see if these entry-level ones can actually stand up to overclocking something like a 10900K, but perhaps you won't need to spend $200+ for the privilege of overclocking on Intel this time around. There are also quite a few motherboards that have launched that say they are PCI Express 4.0 ready, even though these 10th gen Intel CPUs do not support PCIe 4.0. They're still limited to 3.0. But that does mean that even though Intel has not directly confirmed this, there will probably be another family of CPUs launching for these LGA 1200 boards in the future, and it is probably codenamed Rocket Lake, and it will probably support PCIe 4.0. I say this all for the sake of being thorough though. Lots of you are probably pointing out that over on the AMD side right now, you can already get PCI Express 4.0 support with a Ryzen 3000 series CPU and a 500 series motherboard like X570 or the upcoming B550, which we're expecting to launch June 16th. However, and again, this might change soon. If you shop for AMD motherboards right now, particularly for a forward-compatible X570 board, they are sold out or ridiculously overpriced. Also, 500 series boards will probably be the last ones on socket AM4 with support for AMD's 3000 series and yet to be released 4000 series. So both AMD and Intel are kind of in the same boat when it comes to an upgrade path, at least if you're just looking at what's available right now or within the next month, and especially if PCIe 4.0 is something you're after, and if you're considering the next-gen CPUs that are expected to launch later this year or in early 2021. There's definitely more to discuss there, but I need to move on to the benchmarks, so let's move on. Now, you always want to minimize variance between tests and testing setups when benchmarking, so here's the parts I used in all of my test beds for today. For memory, a 16GB 2x8GB kit of G.Skill DDR4 3200 CAS latency 14 memory. For the GPU, we have the Asus ROG Strix RTX 2080 Ti OC graphics card running at its out-of-the-box overclock speeds. For cooling, the 280mm NZXT Kraken X62 all-in-one CPU cooler, and for comparative power draw testing, an EVGA Supernova G3 750W 80+ gold power supply. The systems were all set up with open test beds, and I did my best to have the radiator fans pushing air across the motherboard VRMs just for the sake of consistency. For Intel, I had two test systems. For 8th and 9th gen, I used the ASRock Z390 Taichi Ultimate motherboard, and for 10th gen, I went with the MSI MEG Z490 Ace, or MEG is what MSI wants you to say, but MEG is much simpler. Shut up, Meg. For AMD, we have the Gigabyte X570 Aorus master motherboard, and then I'm running the latest NVIDIA drivers, 445.87, as well as the most recent version of Windows 10 64-bit with all the updates, Windows High Performance Power Plan for Intel, and the AMD High Performance Power Plan for AMD. And now let's go over the actual benchmarks, starting with frequencies. CPU frequency is very important, and higher is better, but frequencies also fluctuate. Here I'm showing the peak frequency each CPU hit, as well as the sustained all-core frequency during a Blender render. The 10900K hit its 5.3 GHz single-core turbo boost right away, but while working all cores, it will drop to 4.9 GHz. That's still impressive across 10 cores, but Intel also has power limit settings to keep the CPU from drawing too much power or overheating, and at stock, these kick in after about a minute. The short duration power limit provides 250 watts for the CPU, but in my testing, once it dropped after 56 seconds to the 125 watt cap of the long duration power limit, CPU frequencies also fell to anywhere from 4.2 to 4.7 GHz across all cores. Next is power draw and efficiency, which is the less sexy side of CPU performance testing in my opinion, but still very important. I'm measuring the wattage drawn by the entire system during a Blender render. This is the new Blender version 2.82a, which does get better results from CPUs, at least as far as I can tell. But AMD is still winning across the board here because 7nm. If efficiency is at the top of your list of important CPU things, you should go AMD. There's just no two ways about it. The 3950X and even 3900X are just ridiculous when it comes to how much power they draw versus their CPU compute performance. On the Intel side though, 278 watts on average for the 10900K looks good if you're comparing it to the 8700K or 9900K, especially if you're also considering the added cores and threads. Intel has made improvements to their 14nm process over the years, but when the power limits kick in, as mentioned when I was talking about frequencies, power draw also drops down to about 182 watts. So I guess that makes sense. It's drawing less power, but it's also outputting a lot less performance. Here are my thermal comparisons though. This is the average temperature after a 10-minute IDA64 burn-in test measured across all cores for Intel, or the CPU T-die measurement for AMD. I think Intel's thin die upgrade for this gen actually is working, because look how nice and cool the 10900K is. Don't be misled though. Power limit duration was reached after 1 minute, so the 10900K was running at 4.6 to 4.7 GHz during this test, not 4.9 and definitely not 5.3. So these three factors with the 10900K tell us something very clearly. Intel has improved thermals, but they are also performing some tricks in order to stay within their somewhat arbitrary definition of what a 125 watt TDP is. They are compensating for the relative inefficiency of their 14nm manufacturing process by limiting available CPU power, throttling frequencies, and leaving it up to motherboard manufacturers to enable settings that open up performance while also drastically increasing heat output and power draw. I know this because I did some overclocking, and I'll talk about that after we go over the stock benchmark results. So So let's start off with Cinebench R20. This is a multi-threaded test. This is a Cinema 4D render test by Maxon. And I want to focus on where the 10900K has made upgrades over the 9900K, and then how it compares, of course, to the 3950X, 3900X, and 3700X, bearing in mind that the 3900X is the most close to it when it comes to price, although the 3900X should be cheaper. It is also 13% faster in this particular test, whereas the old 9900K is 23.3% slower. The performance increase of the 10900K over the last gen part is going to be partially due to the higher frequency, and then of course partially due to the fact that it has 10 cores now instead of 8. Now the single threaded test is where the 10900K should always win if Intel is doing what Intel is supposed to be doing, and it does here. In fact, the 5.3 gigahertz frequency helps it improve over the 9900K, which would have been the former winner in this category, by about 6%. And the 10900K's 5.3 gigahertz frequency does help it beat out the 9900K by about 6%, which is nice. And it even manages to beat out the 3950X, which was the former champion in this test. It's about 2.1% slower now. Come on, 3950X, pick up the pace. Next we have CPU Mark. This is part of the Pass Mark Performance Test Suite, version 9.0. And here with the overall score, the AMD chips all win. In fact, about 40% lead by the 3950X, about a 34% lead with the 3900X, and even about a 4.5% lead with the 3700X, at least in this particular test. The 10900K did manage to beat out the 9900K by about 14%. Here is once again the single-threaded version of this test, and once again the 3950X was the former champ here. It scored 3150. 10900K beat it by 4 points, 3,154, and that did manage to give it like a 0.23% lead. So on the one hand, you could look at this as Intel doing what they set out to do, and on the other hand, you could look at it as, wow, once AMD manages to squeeze out some more single-thread performance, they're really pretty close to Intel, at least, again, in this test. Next, we have Blender, which is an actual application that people actually use for things, rendering in particular. This is the BMW 27 test, but we have upgraded Blender to the new version 2.82a, which from my testing does actually get better scores out of the CPUs and actually does run them a little bit hotter as well. Once again, the 10900K does beat the 9900K with a combination of more cores and higher frequency. However, the 3950X kind of stomps in this one with the 51.5% lead and an overall time of 92.4 seconds. Remember, lower is better when it comes to the amount of time it takes to run through the test. The 3900X also came out on top. It's about 17% faster than the 10900K in this one. Next, we have Handbrake 1.3.2. This software also saw a bit of an update recently, but we're doing a 3 minutes 4K to 1080 transcode using the fast preset. You're looking at time in seconds, and then I've also listed the actual encoding speed in FPS. So I'm comparing the encoding speeds here because that should scale based on the length of the video that you're transcoding. But in FPS, we saw the 3950X with about a 4.4% lead over the 10900K, whereas the 3900X is pretty much neck and neck. Next, we have V-Ray version 4.10.07, which is a computer-generated imagery rendering application developed by Chaos Group. Here, the score renders out in K samples, so a higher score is better. Once again, the 3950X dominating about 41.4% faster than the 10900K in this test. The 3900X managed to break 20K, and that also let it beat out the 10900K by about 8.4%. Here are our results for Corona 1.3. This is high-quality, physically based shading software, which is used for production rendering. Again, time in seconds, so lower is better. With a crazy low time of 56 seconds, the 3950X is once again about 33.9% faster than the 10900K. Meanwhile, the 9900K is about 23.5% slower, so you can see Intel making some gains over the previous generation there. And then again, the 3900X is very close, but still beating the 10900K by about 1.3%. My final pure CPU compute test is 7-zip, and this does zipping and unzipping, file compression and decompression, and you're seeing both sets of numbers here. 7-zip spits out an overall score, so once again, higher is better. It does seem like the 10900K was keeping up a little bit better with the compression test with its overall score of 60,789. This makes it about 14% faster than the 9900K in this test, although once again, all of the AMD CPUs beat the 10900K when it comes to compression, even the 3700X. The story changes a little bit with decompression though. The 3950X though, with that astounding score of 177,430, that's 63.5% faster than the 10900K. Let's switch over to some gaming specific tests, and here we're going to run 3D Mark tests, starting with Fire Strike Extreme. This is a DirectX 11 test running at 2560 by 1440. You can see the overall graphics graphics and physics scores here. The graphics score is relevant to what kind of performance the CPU is able to get out of the graphics card, whereas the physics test is more of a direct CPU test, and this can be equated more to a lot of the CPU compute tests that we just went over. When it comes to graphics though, there's not a whole lot of variance chip to chip. In fact, we're looking at about a 1% difference overall, which means that in this test we were GPU bound most of the time. The physics test is a little bit better of a comparison, and here the 3950X did win by about 11.3%. And perhaps noteworthy here that even though it's about a 1% victory, the 10900K did beat out the 3900X. Next is 3D Mark Time Spy. This is a DirectX 12 test, and once again we're looking at overall graphics and CPU scores, focusing on the graphics and CPU scores. Once again though, GPU scores, again, we're within about a 1% difference of each other, so we're GPU bound in those tests, that's just fine. The interesting thing about the CPU test here is that the 10900K wins. Like, wins straight up across the board. 13,191 beats even the 3950X, which would indicate that the CPU test in this particular benchmark is benefiting more from the high frequency and the reduced latency that the 10900K is bringing to the table. Here's Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm running this at 1920 by 1080 as I am most of the rest of these gaming tests, and that is because at lower resolutions we become more CPU bound than GPU bound, and that will actually show difference or variance from test to test when using the same GPU and different CPUs. Shadow of the Tomb Raider in particular is good at showing variance, especially at this lower resolution, which hopefully is evident because the 10900K pretty much dominated this test. Overall frame rate of 167 FPS, the 9900K and 8700K coming in just below that, 145 and 138, but all of these are besting the AMD CPUs. The best they could do was the 3950X's frame rate of 127.9. Next we have Total War 3 Kingdoms, another DirectX 12 test. This is using the Ultra setting and the campaign benchmark. Here again we're seeing variance from chip to chip, but not quite as exaggerated as we were with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. The 9900K comes in second behind the 10900K. It's about 2.7% slower. But here again the 10900K is seeing some decent measurable gains over the AMD chips. They're all about 9 to 10% slower. Here's GTA 5, DirectX 11, and this has been a go-to benchmark for quite some time. Again, a good one at showing variance, especially at lower frame rates like 1920 by 1080 or even 720 when comparing different CPUs. And the 10900K gets the best score I've seen out of a stock CPU with 178 frames per second. That is again about 6 to 7% faster than the 9900K. And again, the AMD CPUs, 3950X included, can't quite keep up. It is about 8.5% slower. Here's Overwatch because I wanted to include a fast-paced FPS. I had to run this at 2560 by 1440, otherwise the awesome 2080 Ti spits out way too many frames and it goes over the 300 frame rate cap. That said, we are still a bit GPU bound in this test. As you can tell from the Intel numbers, they're all hitting a max frame rate of about 258, although there is some variance in the 1% lows, so you can see a little bit of a benefit with the 10900K there. The 3950X is the best out of the AMD CPUs with a frame rate of 254 FPS, and I do find these really high frame rate tests to be a little bit more valid now than they used to be because we're actually seeing monitors that can hit 240 Hertz or even 280 Hertz, which is actually helpful for gameplay and response time as well. Our final test though is Civilization 6 Gathering Storm. We're using the new Gathering Storm AI benchmark, which tests the amount of time it takes for the AI to run through a bunch of turns on a very complex high-level map. I was expecting the AMD CPUs to kind of come back a little bit here because this is not necessarily all about how many frames the GPU can spit out, but the 10900K was actually able to win once again with a turn time of 30.4 seconds. Again, lower is better here. Again, we're looking at a pretty small variance here. This is less than 2 seconds difference between all of these CPUs. That said, time is money when you're playing a game of Civ 6 and it's super late at night and you just want to play one more turn. So I guess if that is your goal, the 10900K might help you out because it's between 2 and 8% faster than all of the competition. So that was a lot of benchmarks, but what I've done now is I've taken all of the CPU compute benchmarks, the workload benchmarks, and then I've taken all of the gaming benchmarks, and I've weighted them all and I've added them all up so I can give you guys something of a summary, starting here with overall CPU compute performance. I'm using the 10900K as a baseline, so that represents 100% performance. And as you can see, when measured across all tests, the 3900X is about 9.1% more performance, whereas the 3950X is about 27.3% 10% more performance. The 3900X is selling for less than what the 10900K is supposed to be selling right out of the gates, although the 10900K does beat out the 3700X, so you could potentially call that something of a win, because if you look at the 9900K's overall performance, that was previously coming in below the 3700X. And this is a big part of the reason why I've been recommending AMD for some time now. For the same price, or often less money, you can get more CPU compute performance, which may or may not be important to you if gaming is your focus. If gaming is your focus, here's the overall gaming performance, and this one might be a little bit more telling. Now, please bear in mind here, I did not do an exhaustive amount of tests when it comes to gaming. These are going to be somewhat subjective to the resolution I was testing at, which is mostly 1080, and it's also going to vary from game to game. So if you have a particular favorite game that you know you're going to be spending 95% of your time playing, it's well worth your while to go and check out benchmarks for that specific game rather than just relying on my overall boiled down numbers. That said, the 10900K wins. In fact, the 10900K wins, the 9900K wins, the 8700K wins, even against the 3950X. The overall difference is between about 6% and 9%, so it is demonstrable here that Intel has at least achieved their goal of creating what you can once again call the best processor purely for gaming. And I would suggest, even though I didn't do gaming and streaming testing, that with the 10 cores and 20 threads, that this would probably also be a good processor for gaming and streaming at the same time. But desktop computers are typically used for more than just gaming. So here is the price versus performance with all of the prices listed, as well as the performance. And this is sorted by gaming performance, but you can see there the relative performance for CPU compute as well. I've also used updated pricing for the 3900X and the 3950X, since prices have dropped a bit and they don't seem to be just short-term sales. These are prices that have been there for at least a month or so. But I think the most striking matchup here is going to be the 10900K versus the 3900X, because they're both current generation, top of the line chips for their respective platforms. Now the 3950X is pretty impressive, especially when it comes to that overall CPU compute performance, but it's also at least a couple $100 more than a 10900K, for example. So I think the 10900K versus the 3900X is the real head-to-head performance comparison here, and especially with that 3900X's lower price, PCIe 4.0 support, and the fact that you're going to gain 9 or 10% performance increase when it comes to CPU compute tasks, while you're giving up maybe 7 or 8% when it comes to gaming in specific situations. That's the decision that you need to make. Is that trade-off worth it for you? And then of course consider the other details and ins and outs of the platform, whether or not you need PCIe 4.0, and that's how you make your CPU buying decision. My personal preference would be the 3900X with this comparison, but obviously you are your own person and you can make your own decision. But let's talk about overclocking, since I did have a chance to do that. I wish I had spent more time on this, but I have a finite amount of time. But I wanted to quickly show how the 10900K performs when we make it perform the way we would want to make it perform as enthusiast desktop users, which means no silly power limits and stuff, since we have a nice big 280mm all-in-one liquid cooler for cooling. And I just did a quick and dirty OC to do this. I removed or maxed out the power limits. I maxed out the wattage for power limit 1 and power limit 2, max current amperage, max time limit for the short duration power, and just a small plus 0.06 voltage offset for good measure. With these settings in place, Intel's thermal velocity boost said thank you for releasing me from bondage, and pushed the peak single core frequency to 5.4 GHz, as well as then maintaining 5.1 GHz across all 10 cores. Pretty nice. Results are as follows. Average power draw jumped about 100 watts from 280 to 380 max, and average temperatures increased about 20 degrees Celsius from 69 to 91 degrees peak, and from 52 to 69 degrees on average. I ran about half of my benchmarks with this overclock enabled, and I saw a 5.8% increase in compute performance and just a 1% bump in gaming. So as you can hopefully see, Intel has taken some steps to make their 10th gen flagship an interesting CPU, and I think it's fair to say that if you're purely looking at gaming, they have done a pretty good job. Gaming usually taxes a CPU less than tasks like video encoding, so even with power limits in place, higher frequencies can be maintained that lead to measurable increases in frame rates and overall gaming performance. Overclocking, however, shows just how careful Intel has had to be to eke this level of performance out of yet another 14nm chip. Push those parameters a little and you can get higher clocks and maybe a bit more performance, but the trade-off when comparing the performance increase to power draw and thermals leaves a lot to be desired. This, combined with the out-of-the-box performance that you can expect on the AMD side right now, leads me to recommend against Intel unless you really are just all about gaming, and particularly gaming at lower resolutions like 1080, where the difference between CPUs is actually measurable. If you were to take all of my gaming tests and rerun them at 4K, you'd probably see just about zero difference between the CPUs I'm testing, because we would be GPU bound rather than CPU bound. I will sum up though by listing some overall pros and cons for Intel and this launch. On the pros side for Intel, we have Z490 motherboard pricing, which actually seems to be reasonable this time around. Independent motherboard reviews notwithstanding, of course. You should wait and check those out to see if those entry-level boards are actually horrible. Tying in with that, at least temporarily, we have the problems or the issues with AMD's motherboard availability, which are a big issue right now. It's really hard to build something with X570 unless you're willing to pay $350 for a board that originally cost $200. AMD is also losing some of the advantage they've had over Intel with their promise of long-term socket support. And yes, we do have news now that AMD is providing backwards compatibility now with 400 series motherboards for their upcoming 4000 series CPUs. That was nice of them to do. I appreciate that. But it does not negate the fact that AM4 is approaching end of life. So whereas before it was a little bit easier to recommend AMD because of the upgrade path, now we're seeing a little bit more equivalence there, and if for no other reason that AM4 has been around a while and they've got to end it eventually. Also, of course, the gaming performance. You can't deny that. Intel was like, this is about gaming and a 5.3 gigahertz clock speed, and they did do both of those things. On the cons side though, for Intel, we have, of course, no PCIe 4.0 support for now, and Intel hasn't really promised any, so even looking forward to something like that is still a bit of a dubious proposition. We also have the efficiency issues, and you can probably see those in my power draw charts, and that's just because they're still on 14 nanometer, and they're not going to get better in that area until they move on to 10, 7, or 5 nanometer. And then of course you've got that CPU compute performance. That's just all AMD across the board, especially when you combine compute performance with efficiency, but there it is. So hopefully I've given you guys all the data you need to make an assessment and maybe even a purchase decision on whether or not you're interested in this new stuff that Intel has to offer. Of course, I've only been looking at the flagship 10900K, so stay tuned for that 10600K coverage. And I'm kind of interested to see how those i3s perform at some point too, although I don't think Intel sampled those, so you guys might have to wait a few days for that. I really hope you've enjoyed this video though. I will put very important links that you should click down in the video's description. And also, if you can, let me know in the comments what you think of this 10th gen Intel launch. Are any of you just ready to dive in and purchase an LGA 1200 motherboard and maybe a 10900K too? I would be curious to know. Subscribe to my channel as well if you haven't already. Check out my store at paulshardware.net for shirts, mugs, pint glasses, and other cool stuff you can buy. Hit the thumbs up button on your way out if you like benchmarks. Don't forget to keep an eye out for my video on the 10600K coming out real soon, and we'll see you guys in the next one.